Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kankana Hazarika, and I am a research intern at the Institute of Chinese Studies. On behalf of the Institute of Chinese Studies, I extend a warm welcome to all of you to today's ICS panel discussion titled Naming One's Ground, Deconstructing the Recent Indian Moves on the Arunachal Front and the Chinese Stance. The India-China boundary remains one of the most sensitive and complex dimensions of bilateral relations. Despite several rounds of dialogue and mechanisms established to maintain peace along the border, the boundary remains unsettled. As a result, areas that one side considers its own territory are often viewed by the others as intrusions, leading to periodic tensions, most notably the clashes of 2020. The dispute has also expanded beyond the physical border to questions of naming and representations. For nearly a decade, China has been issuing its own names for villages and geographical features in Arunachal Pradesh, calling it Southern Tibet or Zangnan, and India has consistently rejected these claims. Against this backdrop, on 7th August 2026, the Government of India officially designated 27 places and geographical features in Arunachal Pradesh using the standard Indian names on the Survey of India map. While this step is administrative in nature, this move carries clear political significance amid ongoing competing territorial claims. This development raises several important questions like what has prompted India's decisions at this particular juncture, how should China's response be interpreted, and what implications might such reciprocal assertions carry for the future trajectory of boundary negotiations. These are the issues that will guide today's panel discussion. With that, I would like to introduce our distinguished panel. Our first panelist is Ambassador Vijay Nambiar, a veteran Indian diplomat who joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1967. He served in China, Yugoslavia, Algeria, Afghanistan, Malaysia, and Pakistan. As the Joint Secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs, he played a key role in Prime Minister's Rajiv Gandhi's 1988 China visit. He was India's permanent representative to the UN from 2002 to 2004 and later Deputy National Security Advisor. Post-retirement, he served as Special Advisor to Kofi Annan, Chef de Cabinet to Ban Ki-moon, and Advisor on Myanmar. Joining him is Lieutenant General Dipendra Singh Hooda, who was commissioned into the 4th Battalion of the 4th Gorkha Rifles in 1976. Beginning his service in Nagaland during the peak of insurgency, he later commanded counterinsurgency operations in Manipur and South Assam as a Major General. From 2012 and 2016, he served in Jammu and Kashmir and retired as the Army Commander of Northern Command. In 2019, he authored a comprehensive national security strategy document and is now India's foremost commentator on the country's national security. Our third panelist is Dr. Hemant Adlakha, Vice Chairperson and Honorary Fellow at the ICS Delhi. He was previously Professor of Chinese at the Center for Chinese and Southeast Asian Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. His area of research include political discourse in the PRC and modern Chinese literature and culture. He is also on the editorial board of China Report. Moderating today's discussion is Professor Alka Acharya, currently the Director of the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. She was previously Professor and Chairperson at the Center for East Asian Studies, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. From 2005 to 2013, she served as the editor of China Report and earlier served as the full-time Director and Senior Fellow of the Institute of Chinese Studies. Before I hand over to the moderator, I would like to request all participants to follow a few housekeeping rules. All participants shall remain muted during the panel discussion. Questions may be posted in the chat box with your name and affiliation. Alternatively, you may use the raise hand option during the interactive session. You will then be invited to unmute yourself and ask your question. I now hand over to the moderator. Over to you, Professor Alka Acharya. Thank you.
Thank you, Kankana. And a very warm welcome to all who have joined us for our weekly Wednesday seminar. Today's topic, as has been already outlined, pertains to an issue that is unarguably the most complex and difficult one in the gamut of India-China relationship. That is the vexed boundary dispute. And for that, again, as you have already been introduced, we have a truly superb panel of three of the most seasoned experts in their fields. Ambassador Nambiar, one of the most widely acclaimed personality from the diplomatic sphere with vast experience of dealing with China. General Huda, much applauded and decorated, who has traversed the distance from boots on the ground to donning the thinking cap. And Professor Adlakha, with 3 decades of teaching and research, well known for keeping a trained gimlet eye on the Chinese discourse. They will steer us through the different dimensions of the topic and help us deconstruct, contextualize, and analyze what is undoubtedly an unfolding scenario. There, of course, have been a number of posts in the social media, reports of protests in Arunachal Pradesh about the Chinese moves. Little to no official response or reaction, but since discussions on the boundary dispute require much more time than we have at our disposal, it is therefore important that we keep a tight focus on the issue at hand. Our starting point, as the introducer has already said, is the decision by the MHA on 7th August 2026, formally identifying 27 places and geographical features, as they are traditionally known, on the Indian official maps. It is pertinent to note that this decision, which followed in the wake of the 36th meeting of the Working Mechanism for Consultation and Coordination on China-India Border Affairs, which happened in the first week of August. There was hardly any report on the outcome of that meeting, but the decision of renaming undoubtedly would have been taken much earlier. As I read through the admittedly few reports on this, I also found myself, going into another plane and just pondering on the symbolism and the significance underlying this act of naming. From the earliest times, we were told that this very act of naming has been associated with identity, with empowerment, enabling one to acquire power over the named thing. Naming provides a kind of a peg or an anchor supporting the discursive claims. In fact, the MHA reportedly explained that this was done to facilitate accurate recognition, eliminate ambiguity in geographical references, and create a uniform reference framework for official maps and government records. And then, of course, when we deal with place names, there will be a history, associated culture. And if this is not complex enough, we also have the Confucian notion of the rectification of names. Call things by their true name, or the reality gets distorted. So we have a great deal to unpack, but unfortunately, that will have to move into another time and another discussion. One last thing that I would like to mention is that since the setting up of the special political representatives in 2003, which in my reckoning is no less than a paradigm shift in terms of seeking a political solution to the disputed boundary, it has been rather puzzling to me as to why the most significant development in the aftermath of that setting up of the SPRs appears to have been cast by the wayside. And I refer here to the April 2005 agreement on the political parameters and guiding principles, which clearly specified that the settled populations would not be disturbed in the final demarcation. An eminently enlightened kind of a position, and one which had raised enormous hopes at that point of time about a swift resolution. So are there any linkages between this naming underway, and of course the Chinese have been doing it for some more time, and the manner in which this 2005 agreement will be taken out of wherever it has fallen and interpreted and implemented? Does this naming therefore create more complications or facilitates or obviously question marks here? So we will have 2 rounds of discussions. In the first round, each speaker will have 7 to 8 minutes each, and in the second, 5 to 6 minutes each, which will be followed by Q&A. Ambassador Nambiar, I request you to kickstart the discussion, which will help us get a sense of the history regarding the different approaches of India and China to the eastern sector. Now, we know India's acceptance and the PRC's rejection of the McMahon line the sticking point being how the colonial legacy is treated by both the sides. But that does not seem to be the issue today. There are four questions here. When and how did the renaming of villages, of course, by the Chinese to begin with, emerge as an issue with the policymakers and political elite in India? Was it ever on the table of the political elite or the special political representatives as they moved to a political solution? Is this the first time that such a step of naming our ground, as it were, has been undertaken? Finally, what could have been the key factors behind this decision? What is involved in this act of naming? Ambassador Nambiar.
Thank you very much, Alka, for inviting me for this thing. Though as I said, I'm a bit of a dinosaur here because it's been a long time since I've been involved in any of the details of this of the boundary questions, certainly. And I would like actually right at the outset to try and frame this a little more in slightly more limited context of place naming, rather than to talk about the broader picture. But nevertheless, I think the naming of the places in Arunachal Pradesh today is clearly much more than a cartographic or linguistic exercise. It has become a form of territorial assertion. It's clear. And its significance, of course, we'll have to look at it against the history of the boundary dispute, the Tibet question, changing meaning of sovereignty and things like that. China has periodically standardized Chinese Tibetan names for places in Arunachal Pradesh since 2017. India has now begun formally naming places on its own maps in response. I think the latest move is something very, very different and qualitatively different, I think, on the 7th of August, involving 27 locations, and Beijing has objected. India has responded that, of course, Arunachal Pradesh is an integral part. Now, Arunachal historically has had its own tribal Monpa, Tawang, Mishmi, Adi, Nishi, and other indigenous systems of naming and territorial affiliation. At the same time, particularly in the western sector of the eastern sector around Tawang, there were long-standing religious and cultural connections with Tibet, obviously. Now, China's present argument is not simply that these places have Tibetan names. Beijing uses historical Tibetan cultural and administrative connections to argue that the territory itself has belonged to Tibet and therefore to China. That argument has become particularly important around Tawang because of the 6th Dalai Lama, Sangwang Gyatso, being born there in 1683. Now, India's counter-argument is essentially that cultural or religious influence does not establish modern sovereignty. That distinction is fundamental. Now, we all historically know the 1914 Simla Conference was the turning point when British India and Tibet negotiated the boundary that became known as the McMahon Line. We are also aware that the Chinese representative participated but did not accept eventually the convention, principally because Beijing rejected the proposition that Tibet possessed the authority to conclude an independent kind of agreement. Now, after independence, of course, the northeast frontier was formed in 1954, eventually became Arunachal Pradesh as a union territory in 1972 and a state in 1987. And India has progressively transformed that frontier into a territorially integrated political unit. China has obviously not accepted the process. During the late 50s, Premier Zhou Enlai had conceded to Prime Minister Nehru that though China considered the McMahon Line illegal, it was willing to consider the India-China LAC alignment generally along that line. Also, China finalized its boundary agreement with Burma along this line. Interestingly, Chani, the foreign minister, explicitly told Indian officials in regard to the 60 Burmese negotiations that China did not recognize the McMahon Line, but it was prepared to take what he called realistic attitude on the alignment of its boundary with Burma on this basis, using parameters like actual jurisdiction, watersheds, surveys, and local adjustments. This is very important. Now, in 1962, in the war, this also provides us a very important map versus reality kind of test. China occupied almost the whole of Nifa for a period, including Tawang. But in the eastern sector, it withdrew behind the McMahon Line. This is extraordinary when you consider Chinese later claims, particularly saying that they were, uniformly from Qing times, they had unquestioned territory. It was unquestionably Chinese territory, which I think is clearly outside. It's not the truth. Now, there are some very interesting perspectives which the scholar Berenice Guyot-Richard draws in her book Shadow States on the period of this occupation in 1962. I think it's important for us to take some of these and to just highlight some of them. In 62, China wanted to demonstrate, after it occupied the Nifa area, that the Indian state was weak and temporary, whereas the Chinese state was strong and powerful, efficient and capable of delivering order. Now, what it did, it tried to do. Now, what Indian officials and civilians had initially feared was that the Chinese occupation would be brutal. But the PLA deliberately adopted what Berenice Guyot-Richard called a policy of appeasement. Monasteries were left intact. There was no no looting at all. People were paid when the food was requisitioned. Religious practices were respected. And even PLA repaired roads and bridges in order to, which had the Indian authorities, administration had taken years to actually construct. But she says something unexpected happened. The Chinese demonstration of power worked, but it worked against China. This is a fascinating paradox in her argument. The PLA succeeded in demonstrating China's state capacity, and the people could see that China was vastly more powerful, organized, and efficient than the Indian state. But this did not make them want Chinese rule. Why? Because the local population made a distinction between state capacity and political freedom. The inhabitants already knew what was happening in Tibet after the Chinese had taken over, and the inhabitants feared that they would have very little ability to bargain with, manipulate, resist, or negotiate with the state, which was what was happening in India. And her central insight is that the inhabitants did not necessarily choose India, but they had developed or they were choosing India because they developed a nationalist identification in India, but they preferred the kind of state that India represented. So much for discourse power at that time in history. Now, in 62, a Chinese book, The Sino-Indian Boundary Question, published 13 maps, including 2 on this area, which illustrates the Chinese conception of the eastern boundary. The accompanying Chinese texts called it the traditional customary boundary. They talked about Monyul, Loyul, and Lower Tsayul, etc., and a total of 90,000 square kilometers. In fact, they said over 90,000 square kilometers, which actually I think is taken from the English, some 36,000 square miles. Now, an almost contemporaneous Indian study talks about these and says that when the evidence was actually supplied during the talks, there were only 3 small pockets for which the Chinese could actually present evidence, and which they say covered less than 1/10 of the claimed territory. Now, it is interesting that in 1980, Deng Xiaoping offered a package approach where he was supposed to have agreed to make concessions in the east in return for concessions on the north. In fact, I think our colleague Ashok Kant talks about it also. And he confirmed that Tang publicly proposed resolving the boundary issue on the basis of actual areas actually controlled by each other. Finally, you come to the 2005 agreement, which Alka, you have talked about, which in fact contained principles that a final settlement should safeguard the interest of settled populations in the boundary areas. This is important because Tawang was obviously a heavily settled Indian administered area. During the 2005 negotiations, China again pressed for major adjustments in the east, but it accepted the language protecting settled populations reluctantly, but it actually accepted it. It was only in 2006 that the resident Chinese ambassador in Delhi publicly stated that the whole of Arunachal Pradesh was Chinese territory. And then they used the the formulation Zangnan and the nomenclature, etc. Now, why have place names suddenly become more important? The Chinese campaign began systematically in 2017. But the Chinese, in 2021, for example, the Chinese spokesman said that Zangnan has been Chinese territory since ancient times, and that standardizing names was an exercise within Chinese sovereignty. The Indian response was practically the reverse same. A name cannot create sovereignty where sovereignty does not exist. India consistently only decided to call the names invented and to reject them. But we need to understand that the Chinese moves were essentially part of their attempt to set the narrative, to assert their discourse power, and in that sense, India's current response, that is, the response of this August, represents something new. India's recent decision to formally identify maps and 27 locations marks a transition from rejection to counter assertion. We are moving from China names, India rejects, to China names, India names. Both incorporate the names into official cartographic narratives. Now, why is this important? Because we are now reaching a stage of sovereignty by accumulated facts. Sovereignty increasingly is created by a series of maps, place names, roads, border villages, administrative jurisdictions, official websites, postal addresses, elections, infrastructure, military patrols, satellite imagery, cadastral records, government services, all of them. Each fact by itself will have little legal force, but collectively they offer a narrative of effective sovereignty, even though it may be fictional. China understands this very well, and they've been doing it in other places also. Now, they've talked about providing standardized geographical names, and they call this, the naming is part of their broader strategy of administrative normalization. Now, the Chinese logic is name, administer, is to claim, map, name, administer, and repeat the same thing again, and eventually to give a kind of a normalization in the conversation. And this is directed mainly at the Chinese diaspora and their citizens, future generations, international cartographers. They'd like increasingly that to be part of the international sort of, let's say, narrative. Digital mapping systems, international organizations, foreign governments, academic publications, all of these, they hope, will eventually follow, so long as they become a consistent pattern of Chinese naming. Now, this is why India's counter naming is very important. If a disputed place acquires a consistent Chinese name across thousands of maps, etc., it gradually acquires political familiarity. There is no, of course, no general rule of international law under which a state acquires sovereignty merely by naming its geographical features, but it does change the information environment. And that is what is very important. Now,
can we
I think I'll just finish now.
Yeah.
India has also begun, the fact that India has also begun emphasizing indigenous and historical name associations with Arunachal is important. In fact, in 2024, India named a mountain after Chiangse Gyatso, which itself is again significant because it effectively asserts the historical Tibetan Buddhist connection to the region, to this region, just as we have historical associations with Mount Kailash, etc., which is in Tibetan territory. But it has moved within the Indian territorial narrative. China has, of course, notably objected to that move. So I think what we do, we must realize that this is not just a tit for tat naming that we are doing. We also hope that people, administration, infrastructure, connectivity, economic integration, cultural recognition, and our building of military capability and cartographical presence in these 27 names will eventually become the tip of an iceberg and eventually help us in our contest over the production of a territorial reality. And I think from this point of view, I think the present move is intellectually and diplomatically more powerful as an Indian response. The contest is therefore not really about names. It is about who gets to define the historical identity, cartographic reality, and ultimately the political future of the Eastern Himalayas. Okay, I'll end over there. Thank you.
Thank you. I couldn't just stop. I mean, this was absolutely brilliant. I mean, you've sort of given us in about 15 minutes, I mean, a whole historical narrative down to the whole symbolism of what is happening today. I fear we may not have another round to go around, but let's see how it goes. General Huda, I would request you to also look at these two questions from the military security perspective. What could have been the key factors and what is involved strategically speaking in this act of naming? Do these geographical areas which have been named do they have any specific implications for India's border security? Or in other words, are there any significant aspects, locations that have been named which would have a significant impact on the ground reality? And would there be, if any, military or defense related fallout? General Huda.
Thank you very much, Professor Alka. Great pleasure to be here. I think Ambassador Nambiar has given us a sweep of great picture of what the historical background is, what the implications are. I mean, China has been doing this since 2017, and we've just been rebutting it. But I think now we've become more proactive in our approach to how to deal with these things. I don't have any direct information as to why the government chose these 27 names. But analyzing them personally, I find that these 27 names could actually be divided into 3 clusters. And that's how, I mean, as I said, I'm personally looking at it. I think the first cluster is around giving greater identification to the border or the LAC as we understand it. And so if you look at places like Thagla, and if you look at the map, Thagla is marked on the border itself, on what we understand as our border. Then if you go to the upper Subansiri area, you find Zola, Rizala, Pukurla. Again, these are places which are exactly marked on the border as we understand it. So I think there is an attempt to give greater clarity and identification of where we understand that the border lies. Now, I don't know whether this is the first tranche that in subsequent naming of places, if India goes ahead and does it, there is also going to be greater definition. As I said, Thagla is in the Tawang sector, and then Subansiri area, there are 3 very clearly named places. Now, why Upper Subansiri has been chosen specifically? Was it to do with the fact that in this area, in the recent past, we've been hearing some cases of Chinese intrusions and coming into this area? And as I said, I would be keen to see whether this is taken further in further naming. So I think the idea one is that, look, this is what our understanding of where the border lies. So that's the first cluster. The second cluster, I think, is around the fact that, look, our historical memory of what has happened in this area has to be kept alive. And again, you find places which figured in the 1962 war. In Tawang sector, you find Thagla, Jaswantgarh, Vaisakhi. Coming to Subansiri, you find Longju, Maja, Visa. There is also a mention of Sher Thapa Memorial. And as I said, I think it's to do with historical memory. Look, these are places that belong to us. We fought in 1962 over these areas. So it isn't as if there was somebody else's control and we had just sort of left it. We have in some ways led over control of these areas, and therefore we claim them. And to me, the third cluster is around settled population. So you find names both in the hinterland, where there are settled populations, but you also find some significant naming of small villages which are close to the border. So if you look at Lohit Valley, there is a place called Dhanbari. And when I looked at Dhanbari census, it's a village of 18 people, just on the border, the last village on the border. So I think there is also an attempt here to show that these villages, which are very close to the LAC, the whole issue of settled population is there. What is also interesting is beyond the India-China border, there is also naming of places in the Vijayanagar area, which again is a very sort of isolated segment along the Burma border. So I think the third sort of cluster is around, look, these are places where we have our population and where we have administrative control over the people. And I think in some ways it links to the 2005 sort of agreement, that we were talking about. So I think what we are doing here by naming these places is we are making a sovereignty argument. As I said, in probably three parts, that look, this is where the border lies as we understand it. So as and when a border agreement takes place, we have defined on our maps which are the names of the places where the border is aligned. We are also saying, look, these are areas where we fought and bled, and there is a historical sort of memory around these areas. And the third is that, look, these are populations and settlements where we have traditionally exercised administrative control. So as I said, I think it's a way of sort of countering what China calls legal warfare, its narrative, and I think Ambassador Nambiar explained it extremely well. In a specific sort of military sense, does it significantly alter the balance of power along the LAC? Actually not. There, I think we have to do a little more. If you look at the map which has been published, the 2026 map, which accompanies the name, you will see that particularly in eastern Arunachal Pradesh, our roads are still very far from where the border is marked. That came out to me so very, very clearly that our roads are stopping quite well short of the border in eastern Arunachal Pradesh. And therefore, there is a need to improve our infrastructure, not only for military purposes, but if we want to exercise control over border population, border areas that we claim, we will need to do more sort of development in those areas. How it goes in the future, I don't know. But as I said, we still require some significant work as far as infrastructure development, infrastructure improvement to enhance our military capability. How it plays out in diplomacy, bilaterally, how it's going to affect, I'm honestly not an expert, so I'm not going to venture into that area. Rather hear it from Hemant. But so I will end here. Alkan, if there are any questions, we'll talk about.
Okay, I'll just ask you to extend a little bit, because I thought you made an interesting point that the renaming or the naming has been done in places which are actually on the border, which is our perception of the border. However, there is a gap between our infrastructure, which does not really go up to quite to those places. So what we are saying is that we've named the places along what we feel our border to be, but we still do not have the kind of resources which will enable us to go up to those places. So I am really looking at here a kind of a space that is opening up for a potential, if not actually clash, but actually some kind of a difference of opinion which can have security implications. How would you react?
No. So that is true, and I think that's the challenge that we need to look at. If you ask me, frankly, which are our borders with China that are most sort of vulnerable, to something like what the Chinese did in Ladakh in 2020, I would say it's Eastern Arunachal Pradesh. It isn't as if we have just named the places and are not doing anything. So we have regular patrols which are moving to those areas, which in Eastern Ladakh we commonly refer to them as patrolling points. So if we have something marked on the border, we will patrol up to that. I think the issue is because we don't have infrastructure leading right up to that. Some of these patrols, take days, some take weeks for us to go there, patrol that area permanently. We cannot stay there, so we have to come back. So we are attempting. It's not as if we are not exercising or attempting to exercise sovereignty and showing our presence in those areas. But because infrastructure is weak, these areas could remain vulnerable. On the Chinese side, Professor Alka, there are roads coming right up to there. So they have an advantage there. And I think that advantage, realistically, we must understand. And therefore, I'm saying much more needs to be done to develop and build our infrastructure in those areas.
Thank you. I think what we are therefore probably seeing is one of the first steps, and I think Ambassador Nambiar also brought this out, that you also make a claim on the basis of this act of naming, but there are still miles to go before we reach that point of being able to protect those areas which we have named and claiming as our. Thank you very much, General. And now, Professor Adlakha, over to you. Hemant had in fact suggested that we hold this discussion. He had been scoring the Chinese newspapers and responses and social media, and he seemed to believe that they were quite, quote unquote, nonplussed by the Indian action. So he will give us the picture from the other side. What has been the response of the Chinese officials' reaction in social media? How should we assess them? And what should be really the takeaways from the kind of reactions that we see on the other side? Hemant?
Thank you, Alka. And thank you, Ambassador Nambiar and General Huda, because in a way, I'm feeling relaxed and happy that I don't have to be in a position to explain to anybody that after rejecting for 10 years the Chinese place namings, why suddenly we had to do that. And my job is actually the other way around, that how have Chinese taken it or reacted to it if we have now started name placing. As Alka mentioned, yes, I mean, when I saw the Chinese media commentaries and analysis, I mean, it's very interesting that the Chinese commentators themselves pointed out that why did it take China 2 full days to come out with some kind of an official statement in response to the India name place name changes. And then I was actually intrigued and surprised that many Chinese commentators welcomed this 48 hours silence or delay before the Chinese Foreign Ministry came out with a very brief 3-liner rebuttal or rejection of the Indian act. And the Chinese commentators welcome the official spokesperson stand in Beijing, saying that it was brilliant. And why was it brilliant? Because that is where the crux lies, according to them, of India's act. That India wanted to provoke China. And India wanted to test the strengths at the bottom of the Chinese protest and reaction. And the Chinese understood perhaps that, and they did not fall into the trap. And they reacted very coolly and very briefly, and just in a very indifferent, cold-blooded manner, rejected India's act on the basis of 3 points of illegal, invalid, etc., etc. The other thing which I found very interesting was, of course, there's so much that I don't know really how to sum it up in 7-8 minutes or 10 minutes. So what I have done is that I've used, typical of Chinese style, I've used 3 Chinese 4-word idioms to describe the Chinese various writings and reactions, besides the diplomatic rhetoric and the brief official rejection of what India has done. And these 3 Chinese idioms, which I have used based on their writings only, to sum up their reactions. The first one is that boiling frog in the lukewarm water, which of course, all their reactions, I don't know, I should be surprised or not, all their commentaries and reactions have actually addressed almost all the points pointed out here by Ambassador Nambiar and General Huda, both in terms of either political posturing done by India or point scoring, which India thought that India is doing. The boiling frog in the lukewarm water, in Chinese, if I say it, it is Wan Shui Chu Qinghua, literally. Now, what does it mean? It basically means that now India is changing its tactics. And what are these new tactics or strategy which India is employing by this act? There are basically 2 kinds of tactics in this new strategy. The Chinese call it is soft tactics and hard tactics. What is the hard tactics? It's basically related to what General Huda also emphasized, that we need more in terms of infrastructure building up, etc., etc. And the hard tactics is that India is now doing massive investments in border infrastructure, and especially they have a definite plan of billions of dollars investment up to 2030 to upgrade mountain tunnels, military roads, and border railway networks, especially along the LOAC in the eastern sector. Now, how is this hard tactics related to soft tactics? The soft tactics here is that you alter place names, you update maps, and you solidify administrative jurisdiction. And how does it work out? As Ambassador Nambiar also had mentioned it a couple of times, that the Chinese say how India is doing it is, you build a road, you give a name to it, fake name to it, and then you establish a false administrative jurisdiction to justify the altering of names, etc., etc. So, and it goes on and on. I can come back to it during the QA session if there is time left. But let me quickly move on to the next one, which is the second 4 Chinese character idiom is the shooting oneself in the foot. Now, why are they saying that? Because basically they are saying, look at the timing and look at the atmosphere. Look at the timing when India has come out with this act. And in that context, they actually go back to 1962 conflict, which they call counter-defensive war against India. I don't know. I'm not an expert in this, and I've not studied that meticulously and profoundly as Ambassador Nambiar and Alka and General Huda know about it. But I thought maybe we all know, we have discussed endlessly. Today, Ambassador Nambiar also brought it out in the discussion when he referred to a book also of 1962 Chinese withdrawals. Chinese volunteered to withdraw after their victory suddenly. And we have discussed this, various reasons, etc., etc. But I think I came across, every time there is something happening on the border, Chinese come out with a lot of debates and historical references and materials and this time also there's no exception to that. And I thought that I came across a new, I will not call it narrative, but new argument. If you have known it before, then maybe it was my ignorance, but let me share it anyway. And the Chinese say that after the 1962, soon after the first phase of victory, Mao, while speaking to the commander-in-chief Chiang Kai-hua, Mao asked him, was this a military political battle with India or a political military battle? And then before Chiang Kai-hua could reply, Mao himself said, it doesn't matter actually, because what matters is that we achieved our political goal by this military conflict, and which is the peaceful resolution of the boundary dispute with India in this sector. Now, so shooting oneself in the foot is being used in this context, that India is not learning from its mistakes, and India keeps coming out with provocative acts, especially when it is peaceful. And in 1962, Mao had no choice but resort to this military action, because Nehru had closed all the doors for a peaceful negotiation. And then they go on to say that on 18th November, after the first phase of victory, after 1 month of fighting, 18th November, this conversation takes place between Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-hua. And on 19th November, Nehru and Radhakrishnan, this is what Chinese narrative says, due to the rapid scenario of India being defeated, they are compelled to issue a statement, Nehru and Radhakrishnan, and their statement is, and I quote, that peaceful resolution of the Sino-Indian border issue, they are hoping that we can have a peaceful resolution of the border dispute, etc. On 19th November, Mao Zedong is made aware of this statement by Nehru and Radhakrishnan. So he asks his party central committee to verify this. And then party central committee then takes a decision on 20th of November and surprises the world by announcing that from 21st November, China will start the unilateral withdrawal. I mean, this is something which I had never come across before in the Chinese debates, this particular details. That's why I'm sharing it with here. And they go on to then extend this India being provocative during peaceful times to Doklam and Galwan, and now that when 6th, they say that 6th August, there is this 36th meeting of WMCC, and on 7th August, India comes out with this. And that too just weeks before BRICS summit, which India is going to host. So there is a subtle indirect indication linked with whether Xi Jinping will come to BRICS summit or not to New Delhi with this act. It has been pointed out in very strongly worded China Daily editorial. And China Daily editorial had come out in various editions from Beijing, from Hong Kong, and in English, in Chinese, both. And it's very strongly worded. And also in some other commentaries. This has not been discussed much here so far. I've tried to discuss this in an article which will be published perhaps in a couple of days in a national daily. So the reference to shoot oneself in the foot is all starting from 1962 to this particular act of place name changing in a peaceful time, in a relaxed atmosphere, in a situation when the reset, the so-called reset seems to be happening, easing up is happening, Mount Kailash visits are happening, everything is happening, and now this provocative act, typical of India, which India never learns, etc., etc. It goes on. And the third idiom is about drinking poison to quench thirst. which is like Inchan Trikha. Now this is related to again typical. They say that Indian politicians are best at this drinking poison to quench thirst. Because they say that whenever there is a governmental crisis or whenever there is a situation where the government cannot handle, and they're referring here again to Jantar Mantar and the defeat of the government by CJP, etc., etc. And then they say that then they resort to such divert, distractive actions. And this time they have chosen to divert and distract attention of their internal domestic problems and crises by doing these place name changes. And they also say that immediately after name changes, there was this social media hype and media hype that China has intruded along LAC in Arunachal. And they say that it's funny that as the media hype was not coming down, it was Indian Army which actually came out with a statement that no, nothing of this sort is happening. So this is what they also call political posturing, that on the one hand, you create this kind of a situation by provocative acts and all that. And on the other hand, you also try to keep the situation under control by not letting the things reach to a breakdown level, especially with China nowadays. And of course, there are various other arguments which many commentators have pointed out, like India's increasing import from China, and why India is finding it very difficult to reduce that or reduce the dependence on Chinese supply lines, etc., on the one hand. And I mean, to the BRICS particular argument, I will now come to and conclude then very quickly. We say that, of course, the BRICS summit next month is not going to resolve India's border dispute or bilateral problems with China. And India, given its $132 billion US import from China, cannot easily sever ties with China either. So as rotating BRICS host and also a member of SCO, India is compelled to continue to cooperate with China at the same time. So these three factors, when put together and when seen together, they are enough to make anybody see clearly that the relationship between India and China is more likely to remain one of friction and competition and rivalry. But at the same time, communication channels will not be easy to shut down. So I think I'll stop here and then take up more issues in the next round. Thank you.
Okay, I'll just come with a little follow-up here. That very interesting survey of the kind of reaction responses that you've given, and I particularly like the way in which they have imagined, this shooting in the fort, boiling frog, etc. What are the groups or the sections that are coming up with these? I mean, are they scholars or just?
Yeah. So these are scholars, including at the level of Liu Tsung-yi, who is of course considered as very influential voice when it comes to border or boundary dispute with India, and scholars in Futan University and in various other universities, including Nanjing and Renmin University at one level. And then you also have, for example, I mentioned China Daily, that strong editorial. I mean, China Daily is very different from Global Times. And it's taken very seriously, and it is directly under the party, unlike Global Times, which is under the Renmin Report, etc. And then some very serious, regular, influential social media, foreign affairs column writers. So it's not just gossip writing, it's a very serious discussion. That is why I did not go into initially the reactions, official reactions of the foreign ministry or the diplomatic rhetoric and all that, because much more substantive discussion is taking place on these in these institutions and on these platforms.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I agree. It's not casual. What you've explained to us are very structured kind of responses. So, I mean, on that ground, of course, that's very interesting. But I do also recall you saying that the Chinese are somewhat baffled also. So I wonder whether what did you exactly mean by baffled? I mean, because it seems to me that very good kind of deconstruction. Yeah.
Yeah, the baffled part was basically about the timing and the suddenness. In the sense that, like I said, in the past they have given, I mean, they have, of course, they have linked this India coming out with such provocative acts when everything seems to be quote unquote normal. And so you don't expect things going out of the way or slipping out of the control suddenly like that. Of course, there are various other arguments why India did that in the context of the timing also. I'll come to that later. But mainly the reason was that Chinese were taken completely by surprise by the suddenness and the timing of this act. But if you look at into more serious commentaries, then they are also telling you that timing and suddenness fine, but by no criteria or parameter, they are seeing this as a spontaneous or a action which is without any long-term strategic, pre-calculated, pre-rehearsed, premeditated thinking. It's a very calculated move.
Thanks. I think on that, given what Ambassador Nambiar and what General Huda said, I think on that we are in perfect accord and harmony with the Chinese. This has been calculated. This has been an extremely carefully constructed response to what has been happening on the Chinese side for a long time. So I think what now I will do is go straight to the Q&A section session, because I will request 5 minutes at the end to give to our three panelists for just any last thoughts, but let the Q&A begin here. And I must once again thank you all. You provided three very, very interesting aspects here, which, as I mentioned earlier, is clearly an unfolding phenomenon. Chinese have officially have just rejected it. Undoubtedly, the Indian official responses, this is something we've seen in our own territory. And meanwhile, we will be scrambling around to see what would be the repercussions of this. Would this actually lead to a very different stage in the India-China boundary negotiations? Yeah, Hemant, you want to say something? You are muted.
Ask one quick question each to Ambassador Nambiar and General Huda. Now you have to unmute yourself.
Okay, I'm saying yes, you can kickstart the Q&A. Ask your one question. Okay. I'll take clusters of questions, and after you have asked, then we will open the floor. So, Kangana.
Okay, I mean, it's not a question in the real sense. For General Huda, this is more like a query, because last year when China came out with, I think, the fifth time the name change of places, there were some reports in the Chinese media, and this time also when I was reading the reactions in the Chinese media, it has been mentioned again that last year the Indian Army actually carried out name changes in 30 places along the LAC in the eastern sector, but it was never publicized or made public. Is that true?
So I'm honestly, I am not aware, but what I can tell you is that these names that have been now sort of publicly put on Survey of India maps, on the army maps, these names always existed. So the maps that were issued to the military, these names were always there on the maps for us to be able to identify exactly where our border is. It's not sometimes there is a feeling that the India-China LAC is sort of undefined, undemarcated. There is some confusion about where the boundary lies. Let me tell you, on the maps that the Indian Army has, it's very clear as to this is what our boundary is, this is what you're supposed to do. There is absolutely no confusion about troops on the ground that, oh, where does the LAC lie? It is very clearly marked. So all these names are actually on the military maps, or they already exist.
Okay, thank you. And Ambassador Nambia, to you, again, half question, half query type of a thing, that you mentioned on the Chinese name changes, you repeatedly mentioned that China, of course, China says these areas belong to the Chinese since ancient times, for centuries, etc., etc., and they always, whenever they came out with the name changes, they came out with the whole list of whole information from tradition, from history, and trying to lay claims to sovereignty, etc., etc. And then you gave a counter argument also that how it does not necessarily establish sovereignty because it is ancient times, etc. So to the Indian name change specifically to 27 names, which Chinese, of course, are saying that they are very key area, key location. All the 27 locations are very key and sensitive areas, etc., etc. But they are also at the same time saying that since India does not have any such historical or traditional claims other than the McMahon line, which China rejected, so they're using another forward compound or idioms. They're saying that if there is no skin, how will you attach hair to it?
Okay, now my argument to that would be we have a lot of names and historical associations and a lot of depth of cultural as well as religious thing to many areas in Tibet, like in Kailash and all the others. Does that give us a claim to it, to those areas? Now that is a very interesting question we can ask to the Chinese. The fact that we do not have any direct, the fact that it is not only Tibetan areas that are talked about in Arunachal. There are many other tribal areas also and those tribal areas, their association with India has been established, and therefore, if they belong to those tribal names, etc., I'm not aware. Let me tell you, I'm not aware of the exact 27 names. I've not had the. I mean, I don't even have the access to all these details. So at this stage, I really have not gone into any minuscule kind of examination of this. But from what I can understand, they are not brought. They have not manufactured names. They're names which have actually come in the process. There may be some names which have been associated with recent developments, latter day developments. That is quite possible. And those names that are again natural evolution of this thing where you have certain names which come, but most of these names have developed out of the normal naming exercises of not just Tibetan, but all the other various tribal groups that are. Now, the Chinese have talked about since Qing dynasty, and then they say 90,000. The whole of Arunachal Pradesh is not 90,000 square kilometers. It's only 83,000 square kilometers as far as I'm aware. And of that, Tirap has nothing to do with Tibetan. That's in the Tirap is almost abutting Burma and that is about 1/10 of this thing. So how does this 90,000 come unless, and they put it entirely in terms of they in a sense identified it with the Arunachal Pradesh province now, particularly since 2007. Now that gives a very interesting kind of they obviously themselves, I don't think there is a very clear indication when the original in the 50s when it was made. As far as I'm aware, Alistair Lamb did talk about a certain 36,000 square mile kind of, there were some relationships which the Tibetan relationships it talks, and Alistair Lamb talks about this, and they've actually lifted it from there. And as during the discussions in 60, they were not able to give very many details of the various the Tibetan kind of the relationships also. Only in 3 areas they were able to give area. The entire wedge kind of thing. So I think it is important for us to remember that these are, you know, 4 character phrases they've always used about lifting a rock to drop it on your own feet. Now, that can very well be said about China too. You see, the fact that they've now begun to react in the manner which they have about Indian naming exercises, as far as I can see, shows, in a sense, it betrays a certain amount of anxiety on their part that this exercise of narrative building can work both ways. We also can build our narratives, and in fact, particularly the naming of that mountain range on the name of the Dalai, the former Dalai. It's a huge thing, and we are not ashamed to talk about it because we do have a relationship, and that, I think, that sense of non-defensiveness about what we have been doing more recently is something which I think they have been taken by surprise, and that is what accounts for the surprise in China about the most recent sort of actions by India. And I think from that point of view, it has been. I think it has shown a certain amount of imagination that we are able to, in a sense, also play the same game which China has been playing on their South Tibet, of being able to build a narrative and be quite unabashed about it. I think it has given them a certain bit of their own medicine. That's what I would say.
Yeah. Thank you, Ambassador. In fact, that's I was trying to suggest that maybe this particular, that's why it was like the word tit for tat had been used initially. Maybe that this is, this makes us enter another kind of a stage of interacting, confronting each other, because the naming then acquires a very different kind of a dynamic in the entire process. So I think that is the interesting thing. That is why I also said it's unfolding. But let's get to the Q&A. I think our audience has been very patiently waiting to. Kangana, can you just read them out?
Yes, Professor. The first question is about Payal Jain. She's a PhD scholar from Jain VU. And her question is to Lieutenant General Huda. She asked, how does this infrastructure gap affect India's ability to respond to China along the Arunachal border? And does weak infrastructure limit India's military options even if India has the political will to respond?
Should I go ahead or?
Yes, sir. Please go ahead.
Okay. So thank you. Interesting question. Look, this infrastructure mismatch has existed for decades, so it's not new. And therefore, what the Indian Army strategy has been is to have a very strong forward posture in the crucial areas. So even where, for example, road infrastructure does not exist, you will find posts have been set up close to the line of accurate control. Some of them traditionally have actually been air maintained, because you can't maintain them along the ground. So we've used helicopters, etc., to maintain these modes. So the strategy, as I said, has been to have a robust, strong forward deployment along the LAC. Now, obviously, that does not mean that 100% infrastructure disadvantage can be overcome. There are areas where along the LAC, particularly in Arunachal, where you could find intrusions sort of happening. But I think what we need to understand there is that while there may be some initial advantage as far as Chinese military is concerned, does not stop us from building up our forces into that area. It might take a little while. And I think what we have shown in Ladakh is that, look, any attempt by the PLA to change the status quo is not going to be easily accepted by India. That we will build up. The fact that 4.5 years the standoff continued in eastern Ladakh shows that there is political will and there is military capability to respond despite some initial advantages that the PLA. So would they be willing to sort of engage in another sort of weeks, months long round. We saw that in Doklam. So I think we should not be also that concerned that the Chinese will do something, there will be a change in status quo that is going to be easily accepted by the Indian political leadership or the military. That is not going to happen. Certainly, there are some advantages that they have as far as terrain and infrastructure is concerned.
Yeah, let's go to the next one. Just ask the question from Dr. Rita.
Yes, the question is for Ambassador Vijay, sir. What will the impact of India's move in upcoming BRICS summit hosted by New Delhi? And second, will it be a matter of tension in bilateral relations, specifically when both countries are making efforts to normalize their ties?
My response to that was, I don't think there will be any particularly deleterious impact as far as I can see of this question being raised. It raises a similar question. We have also had to face a fair amount of embarrassing issues because of the Chinese claims. That has not prevented us from reaching forward and having meetings in a BRICS context or any other context. The Chinese relationship with Pakistan has been bedeviling our own relations for a long time. I don't see why having problems and continuing problems on some of these issues is going to affect meetings, because it is not as if we've done something which is in a sense, how provocative can they read, how much of provocation can they read in this if they've been doing it all the time and have not felt that it is a provocation for us? So as far as I can see, I would not think that, if they wish to make an issue out of this, I think there will be a certain amount of discussion, but I don't think that this is going to have an impact in the sense of it's going to the presenting of 27 names is going to prevent Xi Jinping from attending a BRICS summit if he had otherwise decided to admit. It could be used as a pretext, but I don't think that it would be credible for the Chinese to take up this particular issue and make it a kind of a case, an excuse for any major sort of reaction of that nature. And as far as the bilateral relations are concerned, I think this thing was, I think it was Hemant, I think, who talked about the comments about Indian trade, that we were forced to deal with Indian trade. I don't know if he's read Santosh Pai's particular article, which appeared recently it's a book chapter, in which Santosh has made an argument that it is as much of a kind of let's say a requirement or a need for Chinese exporters to have even transshipment and third country opportunities to continue their exports to India, because that is an important aspect of their export, their own sort of urge to export. So I don't know whether these things would be used to pose obstacles in any developing dialogue which we will have between the two countries, in order to manage the relationship that we have. And I think that if there are objective reasons for both countries to be able to develop their relations and put it on some kind of stable path, that I think will follow, despite the kind of positions which we'll take on issues like the naming of places in Arunachal, because that's a long-term kind of issue on which people are setting their grounds up. They're setting up their narratives. If China can take action to settle its own narrative, India can do the same. I don't think there's any problem. I don't think that it'll affect the ties from that point of view.
And if I may just sort of supplement that a bit, in the sense that if we look at the initial Chinese response, as Hemant also pointed out, very terse, very brief, just complete rejection. And take it in the kind of, let's say, long line of incursions that keep happening. An incursion happens, a statement is made, and people go back to business. Unlike what happened in Galwan or other kind of where actually face-to-face troops or combat or fighting, these would fall in the category of, a claim, rejected, statement passed by the official kind of agency, and then it's back to business. But as I said, that this is a different kind of a chapter that is opening up in the way in which India and China are going to make their claims in the Arunachal sector. So that's what is going to be interesting. Yeah, next question, Kanu.
Next question is by Abdullah Ansari. He's a student from JNU. He asked, the People's Party of Arunachal, a regional political outfit in Arunachal Pradesh, has alleged that China's People's Liberation Army, PLA, troops are blocking Indian forces from accessing key patrolling points in the taxing sector, and what the Indian government is doing to get there to reach the point.
Rhoda, I think you would have to.
Okay. So I think the army has given out a statement saying this has not happened. I just want to make a sort of larger point. I think somehow the feeling I also read is that, look, the Chinese military is coming. They are carrying out salami slicing along the LAC. This word salami slicing I hear a lot, and that slowly over a period of time, there are areas that have gone under their control. Let me tell you, this is absolutely not true. Yes, there are areas where face-offs occur. There are disputed areas where they come in, we go in. I have not seen in 50 years any significant or any changes that have happened along the LAC. The military, as I said, is very clear. This is where the LAC lies, and that there will be no change in status quo. We did have a situation 2020 to 2024 in Eastern Ladakh. And there, wherever the Chinese had attempted to come across the LAC, they have gone back. Yes, there are some different arrangements as far as patrolling zones, etc. are concerned. But I just want you all, the young people at least, not fall into this narrative that somehow the Chinese are just coming in across the LAC, doing whatever they want, and that we are very defensive, we are not able to do anything. That honestly is wrong. Just want to make that point.
Well, there's another note of this being on the defensive. The next question by Nirmal, who's also posted the China Daily article. And his point is that aren't we on the defensive because we are renaming places only within or naming them by their local, only in our territory. And we are not claiming Chinese territory or places in Chinese territory. Whereas China is naming places within Indian territory with an agenda. I think all three of you can get in here, or maybe Ambassador Nambiar, you could start, and then you could take up.
I can make a limited point, and that is, this is not a defense. It's a retaliation in a sense, yes. To an extent, it is a retaliation, but this is in order to in fact, confront the information kind of, let's say, barrage, which is sought to be put by this accumulation of facts like this. So I think this is, in a sense, an attempt to change the information environment. I think that is very important, and I think that is important because ultimately, China has been talking of discourse power, and if they can talk about discourse power, I agree that there is an enormous amount of way in which the international opinion, international, organizations, foreign governments, academic publications, the way even the media, if you constantly find them adding their own names, etc., you will find that is being used increasingly in the international. So what we are doing is we are also coming, in a sense, stepping up to the plate, and we are bringing our own, particularly the names. And as General Huda has said, there are some areas where we we will have to take specific measures in terms of meeting our own infrastructural requirements and getting our services to the people. These will have to happen, and it is not as if every country has that kind of ability to reach out all its infrastructure right up to the end of its boundary. This has happened in many places which are unreachable or which are difficult to access. There are things like that, and I think it is important for us. It's not defensive. I think we are filling gaps. That's what I'm saying, and eventually stepping up to the plate with regard to the information environment. That's how I would put. And I think this is a new qualitative change which I think is needed, and it's a good thing that has happened.
And General Huda, I'll take this question to you with a slight twist, in the sense that you mentioned that, on the army maps, for instance, these names have always been what they are, and this is what it is like. But that would again pertain to, as far as the question is concerned, those areas within our territory. Now, there are disputed points. Are we also then taking this naming to those disputed areas which we claim as our own, but therefore there would be a contestation of a different kind compared to this naming of those which are within our territory? So do you see anything there?
No, Professor Alka, we are even disputed areas. Longju, for example, has been disputed since 1959. Yeah. And we have named it. So it's not as if we have sort of deliberately being sensitive about disputed areas. We are naming them as I think it's a proactive, positive step. We should not look at it as defensive. We were defensive when we were just sort of saying China has done this and we don't agree with this. That was defensive. By naming our areas as ours, I think it's a more offensive rather than a defensive step.
Yes, absolutely. Hemant, is your reading of the Chinese sources telling you they see it as a defensive reaction or some kind of forced to react to the Chinese? Reactive?
Defensive for whom?
On the India's part. Defensive.
No.
Do the Chinese see this as a defensive reaction by India?
No. They think that India is now suddenly changing its tactics, as I mentioned earlier. And like General Huda mentioned, this Lanchu of 1959, and they have mentioned in their articles many other places also, including Tagra Pass, which was the core battle area of 1962 war. And they also say that all the 27 locations or areas or names which India has changed, they actually are all in Zangnan or South Tibet area, which is now under Indian control. So basically they are saying that all 27 names are in our area, which now India has started giving its own names. And in Hindi, they also mention that. At the same time, they also say that, for example, India is indulging in a very ridiculous act in the sense of, for example, all of us can recall that on the data sharing on the river water and etc. And they are saying that, for example, Indian Foreign Ministry has been demanding from China to share data on this Tsangpo River, etc. So they have actually given examples of India's water tyranny with Pakistan on Chenab River and Indus River Treaty, because India is in a better position there. And here, because China is in advantageous position, so therefore India is taking a completely different stand. Why couldn't India took the same stand vis-a-vis Pakistan, what it is taking vis-a-vis China here, asking for data sharing? Why is India refusing data sharing with Pakistan, for example? And at the same time, they also say that India has never signed 1997, that Ambassador Nambiar can correct me or correct the Chinese if he wants. They say that India has not joined 1997 UN Convention on the law of non-navigation use of international waterways. India has refused to sign that. So on what basis India is asking for data sharing? They're raising these kind of questions also, especially in the context of Assam floods and Brahmaputra and etc. So they are saying that these are Indian tactics of in the name of water sharing data, they're actually asking for classified information from China on these areas.
Yeah, thanks, Hemant. I think, we are reaching the end of our time. We've just got about 5 minutes. I don't think there will be any time for wrapping up kind of statements. But there's one long question by Payal, which is pertaining to the entire question of Sino-Indian relations as a consequence of Rajiv Tang, and what are the differences between the Modi-Xi kind of interactions. So, Payal, I really would, very sorry, but we really can't get into this because this is huge comparing two leaders across this. I think what we will do is request Ambassador Nambiar to give you some time and you can get into that issue. But there is one final question from Malika, which we will take up. And she says anybody can answer it. Can the strategy of act of naming by India and China against the backdrop of the neoliberal world order, with strong authoritarian states, be understood as sovereignty claims and border disputes over land and resources, facilitating dispossession, hill tribes in this case, and capital accumulation, particularly through large-scale infrastructural projects in the name of development, which is as much unequal as one can witness. Okay, now this is a really complex question. Yes, let me just kick it off by saying that, well, the act of naming is one end of the scale, and the other end goes on towards, reclaiming, then sending in the kind of development, large-scale development projects and dispossession. I mean, those come into a slightly different category of issues when you go and develop lands, and of course, all the attendant issues of dispossession and displacement and so on. So I would say that in my mind, what we are looking at this point is the opening of a new chapter in the Sino-Indian approach to the question of the border in the eastern sector and what you raised. So if there are any other responses that Ambassador Nambiar or General Hemant would like to give to this?
Nothing very much more than what you've said, Alka, except that I might state that, this kind of larger, let's say, concatenation of encounters between small communities and larger states, whether in a sense, against what you call the backdrop of the neoliberal order. Now, I think that for smaller communities to think in terms of, how large-scale infrastructural projects can affect development of indigenous small communities, these dialogues and these disputations can take place in an atmosphere, I think, better in an atmosphere that is in India than in an atmosphere, say, in China. I think that is an important clarification. And my references to Berenice Guillot-Richard actually provides exactly that answer, because they would prefer it. It's not that they were all strongly pro-Indian, but they see that the ability for a dialogue to take place between communities and authorities is far more realistic and possible under systems like that in India than in a situation where it's a complete, and then it'll all be sort of papered over, and you probably find, of course, I'm not suggesting that the situation there will not be any discourse. There will be discourse, but the nature of the dialogue will be, I think, there would be a lot more transparent, a lot more open, and a lot more in keeping with the developing, let's say, thinking consensus, let's say, trend around the world. It would be more reflective of how people would react to similar situations around the world if it was in a country like India, which is relatively more transparent. I think I may be biased. Obviously, I am biased as an Indian, but then I think it would be better than would be a similar situation in across the border in Tibet. So that's the answer I would give.
What about General Luda? Any reaction?
Look, I think the immediate requirement is infrastructure development, not merely for the military, but for the local villages and population which are on the border. What are we hearing now? We've been hearing for many years that people in border areas are vacating those villages because they don't find enough scope in these areas. So I think, yes, I mean, subsequently, 20, 30 years down the line, what happens to local population? But right now, I think the requirement is that we bring in development for these border villages. Otherwise, you will find these border villages soon will get vacated. And again, those are issues then about what areas do you control, what happens with them.
Hemant, any concluding thoughts on this question?
I just wanted to quickly clarify one thing which Ambassador Nambiar mentioned my name as my comment on China, India not finding it easy to sever its imports from China, etc. And then he suggested
not
that.
you.
So
You're
I
referred
was
to.
only,
Yeah.
I was only being a messenger. That was
Yes,
not my comment.
No, I
And
realize.
yeah, thank you. And about this particular point, I think I'll go ahead with both General Huda, who of course based on his experience also, and all of us know also that what is the situation of development in our border areas, etc. So I think I have no issues with that. That if we concentrate more on developing infrastructure for not just for military but for border people's living and civilian ends also. And I'm not very sure about, especially in today's context, that India is a much better is in a much better situation, democratically speaking, than China for smaller community, etc. As Ambassador Nambiar was saying. When we see reports about China having what China has done on its side of the border, then of course we attribute motives to that. And now we have woken up to that reality and we are now doing something. So I think that I would not particularly be keen to take a stand on this, that India is a better bet than China, etc., etc. Let's go by the reality and then decide.
Okay, thank you. I think
Point taken. Point taken. Okay.
so. I think we have to very regretfully close this. I think what has happened is that starting with renaming, I realized that that was the core of the onion. We've been peeling away the layers. Very, very interesting facets have been emerging. I do believe that this is a very different kind of an addition to the overall dialogue between India and China on approaches to the boundary dispute and, of course, the disputed areas. And this renaming is potentially a new, and I would say a much more creative chapter has opened up. It has economic, political, strategic, military dimensions. But in the main, I would say that it is also about the way in which we will reclaim our respective histories, our cultures, the way in which we will seek to extend control to the peripheries. You know, the center periphery kind of tension has existed for a long time. The areas in the Northeast have by and large felt that to counter the Chinese, the Northeast was strategically deprived. And that has proven kind of a bit of a alienating factor, if you will. So maybe what we are seeing is the beginning of a new phase when people in the Northeast get their due in economic developmental terms, get access to transportation and networks through this building up of infrastructure. So that's really a huge new dimension that has come up. But thank you all very much for a very, very interesting discussion. And I think, as I said, we may come to the round 2 in due course. So with that, I will ask our Kangana to just bring an end to this session.
And thank you, and big applause to Alka also.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Alka. Yes.
With this, we come to the end of today's panel discussion. We thank Ambassador Vijay Rambiar, Lieutenant General Dipendra Singh Hooda, Dr. Heman Adlaka, and Professor Alka Acharya for gracing today's panel discussion with their presence and for giving us their valuable time. We also thank the audience for joining us today. The video of today's panel discussion shall be available on the ICS YouTube channel. We extend a warm invitation to all for the upcoming seminar. Details about upcoming events can be found on the ICS website, and you may also subscribe to our newsletter for regular updates. Thank you everyone for joining us today.